Okay, I am your next speaker. I am not Rachel Gregg, though. I'm Nicole DeCrappeo. I'm with the Northwest Climate Science Center, and I'm going to be talking today about the Available Science Assessment Project, or ASAP, as I'll be referring to it. This is evaluating the science behind climate adaptation actions. And the reason that Rachel is not here is because she took a terrible fall last week and shredded the ligaments in her ankle, and her doctor forbade her from traveling. So I'm sure she's happy and drugged up at home. I hope so anyway. So I'm going to do my best to represent the ASAP team, which consists of Rachel with EcoAdapt and her colleagues. We had Lisa Gaines from the Institute for Natural Resources and her team there as well. They're based at Oregon State University and Portland State University. And then the Northwest Climate Science Center, myself and the director, Gustavo Bisbal. So we're all collaborating on this project. So just very quickly, I'm going to give you in a nugget what ASAP is. We're interested in evaluating the science behind very specific climate adaptation actions that are used in response to different climate change stressors. So this is sort of the first installment of what we hope to be many installments of the ASAP project. And we, through this initial one, are developing the process behind doing these reviews. So I'm gonna be describing to you this process that's been developed through this project. So just to give you a little bit of context about what drove us to do this. Of course, climate change is forcing sort of a paradigm shift in decision making, and so some of the challenges and the questions that we hear articulated to us are things like, well, how do I identify and prioritize climate adaptation actions for my resource area? How should science be produced and used? You've heard plenty of talks, I'm sure, at this point about actionable science and co-produced science. And so how is it that scientists and managers can work together iteratively to produce science that's meaningful to them? What's good science? That's sort of an open-ended question that we always have to kind of evaluate when we review the literature. And are currently used management actions supported by scientific knowledge or data, or are they just legacies of a management agency, something that's been used for a long, long time, or a particular manager's been using for a long time without a lot of scientific support behind it? So we kind of taken on this first challenge that I mentioned of how can managers identify and prioritize specific adaptation actions to implement. With our thinking is basically that actions that will have a higher probability of being successful if they're informed by some scientific data or support. So we saw this as an opportunity to apply a very specific method for synthesizing technical information as it relates to management actions in a way that will be readily accepted as both objective and actionable. So I think that'll become clear as I go through the process. So the goals of the ASAP project, I am going to read this to you because this is kind of central to the whole project. So this is to identify, synthesize, and assess the body of scientific knowledge on these specific on-the-ground climate adaptation actions. We want to help define the conditions, timeframes, and geographic areas where particular actions may be most effective for managers. So just to give some clarity to that and give some definitions, we're identifying these on-the-ground adaptation actions. These are actions that are taken to decrease vulnerability or increase resilience of a species, population, or ecosystem to climate change. We're going to summarize and review the existing science on those select CAAs, and then, again, assess conditions for using them in resource management. This is a pilot project, as I mentioned. We're developing a process here for the review of science. So, very quickly to give you an overview of the process. There are 4 phases that we developed. The first phase was just to identify these climate change stressors from climate change strategy documents that have already been developed by basically every federal, state, local, tribal agency at both the national and regional and local levels. So what we did is we went through these and we extracted the climate change stressors that those agencies identified were high priorities for them. So increased fire severity, sea level rise, reduced snowpack, etc. By a process that I'll describe in a second, we chose one of those. Okay, so we're going to talk about fire. From here on out, this pilot project is about fire, which is obviously a huge topic. And so we move now to phase 2, which is to identify the climate adaptation actions that are used in response to increased fire severity, for example. And so now we're looking at these next level plans. So these are basically these climate change adaptation plans, are a little bit finer resolution where they're listing these adaptation actions and talking about how they can implement them on the ground. So again, we're looking for the most commonly cited actions: forest thinning, prescribed burns, planting seed, a fire-resistant species, etc. The third phase is to actually conduct a systematic review of the science of the most used climate adaptation action. And the fourth phase is to evaluate and, of course, share the results of the review itself and this ASAP process. So why did we choose fire? Not too surprising here in the West. Climate-driven changes in fire regimes in the western United States. Fire is expected to increase in severity, frequency, extent, size. This presents threats to habitats and species, public health and safety. We hear from a lot of our partners that fire is obviously a high concern to them and their resources. So that's kind of in a nutshell very quickly why we chose fire. And then we had to bound this in some way, of course. There were lots of places where we had to put boundaries on this. And so we decided to focus on national forests within the Northwest CSC's geographic footprint, which is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and western Montana. And we chose to focus on national forests for a couple of reasons. One is that the national forest, the 2012 planning rule, sort of mandated national forests to incorporate climate change into their forest planning. So they have already sort of thought about their management actions and their forest planning in the context of climate change. So we knew that they'd already started to be thoughtful about that. And they have these annual climate change performance scorecards that they have to fill out. Again, kind of an annual way for them to assess their organizational capacity in addressing climate change on their national forests. So we've now identified fire. Now we're moving into phase 2, which is to identify these specific fire-related climate adaptation actions. And this part of the project was performed by the EcoAdapt team. So Rachel Gregg and her team did this. And they sort of took a two-phased approach. There's a review and categorization of these CAAs in the literature, so these climate adaptation plans, as well as grade literature and things of that nature. And then they did verification of those climate adaptations through interviews with managers. And that was important just because we wanted to make sure that what we were reading in these plans was actually what people were implementing on the ground. We have 34 national forests within the Northwest Climate Science Center's geographic footprint. And so from those 34 national forests, Rachel and her team identified 109 documents that were relevant to our process here. So again, these are white papers, forest plans, general technical reports, etc. And so what they did, Rachel and her team, so now again, they're identifying these fire-related climate adaptation actions. You see a sample of those on the left, things like thinning or mechanical fuel treatments or prescribed fire. There's a general description, but what's important here is their climate relevance, because all of these have been used in the past for just forest management. It didn't necessarily have a climate angle to it. But what we're really specifically interested in, obviously, is what's the climate relevance of that action, and how are you thinking about it now in terms of managing for future climate, excuse me. The EcoAdapt team created a scoring mechanism to be able to look at whether or not one of these actions was used and if it was a high priority. And prescribed fire, as you see highlighted there, was the most often used and the highest priority climate adaptation action. So now again, this was from the literature. So Rachel and her team then did interviews with a number of forest managers across the region. They started with a list of 125 contacts and narrowed that down. They were trying to get a broad sampling of expertise and different levels within the Forest Service. So they selected 30 contacts representing a lot of the forests, about 30 forests across the Northwest. And they conducted semi-structured interviews with these managers. So they asked them different questions about why you use a particular adaptation action, where you use it, etc. So here's a couple of results graphs. I have some results. So the interviews, for the purpose of why these managers use, for example, prescribed fire, they use it for fire preparedness or fire response or for climate-related changes in fire regimes. And prescribed fire was one of the top adaptation actions used in each of these circumstances. Similarly, for location, whether they use this in a wilderness, or non-wilderness, or wildland-urban interface, prescribed fire, again, was one of the top actions that was used across the board in all of those situations. So then when we look at the literature review along with the interviews themselves, we see a nice match between, yes, in fact, prescribed fire is something that these managers use. It's in their documents and they use it on the ground. So with that, we kind of had narrowed down our focus finally. We have prescribed fire as a climate adaptation action that we want to now evaluate the science behind. So that was, I mean, it was a long process to even get to that. Okay, so you can kind of see how we're going here. Now we're into phase 3, so we're starting to now go into the systematic review phase. So this is where we're going to start to evaluate the science behind prescribed fire, the different conditions, techniques, time frame, scale, location, etc. So the systematic review process is one that is a pretty specific, it's a protocol that has been adapted by Lisa Gaines and her team at the Institute for Natural Resources. It was adapted from the medical community, and they're now using it in the context of natural resource questions. So there's a very sort of almost a very strict protocol to follow, which goes through a series of steps where you identify the management action, you develop your search protocol, you have some filtering, you review the literature, you do a synthesis. So again, they had already sort of developed this within their shop. This is the primary question that we came up with because, of course, we had to, again, put some bounds on this. We needed to focus. The literature on prescribed fire is humongous, so we had to put some bounds on it. I'm going to just give you so I'm not going to read this one, but I'll give you a second to read this. This is our primary question. And so to be included, a reference or a journal article, it needed to explicitly link prescribed fire use and climate change in some way. For example, it had to be either the rationale for the study or it had to link the findings to management under climate change. So again, that was a very important element to this whole project. This is just, you don't need to understand this particularly, but it again goes through kind of their search protocol. They have initial literature search, there's a filtering process, they expand the search, there's a filtering process, etc. So you end up with the end, you can see in yellow, we ended up with 124 journal articles or gray literature or pieces of literature that ended up making its way through the full process for review. So then we had a scientific review panel, an expert review panel, go through those 124 pieces of literature and give their opinions about not only the literature itself, but the process that we had used up to that point. So then they're also helping us identify some knowledge gaps and research opportunities, and they came up with a list of key themes from the literature that they also discussed through this process. So finally, we'll get to some findings of the science review panel. Okay, so we'll go through these in a little bit more detail. So first of all, the rationale and the guidelines for prescribed fire use in the context of climate change, it might shift, but the actual mechanics are not likely to change all that much. So what we know is that prescribed fire and fuels management can reduce the intensity and or severity of wildfire at the forest stand level. But what we don't know is really the effectiveness of prescribed fire in reducing number or extent of large wildfires at the landscape level, regardless of whether or not these fires are climate related. Okay, so we really don't actually know how effective they are in the long term at reducing fire risks. So the next steps for this, so this report is now being written up as we speak, kind of the synthesis, findings, and things like that. And then we go to phase 4. I don't have the phase listed here, but this is basically phase 4, which is the next step, which is in January of 2016, there'll be a manager scientist workshop. And it's very important at this point for us to bring the managers back into this in a very real way and discuss with them first of all, we want them to tell us about their management agencies' plans and priorities for managing fire under these future climate conditions. And then we'll share what we've found through the systematic review process, sort of the state of the science here on prescribed fire in the context of climate change. And then we'll talk about this third point, I think, is maybe the most important one. What aspects of the scientific consensus on prescribed fire's mitigation effects become uncertain in the context of climate change? We'll identify further knowledge gaps and talk about partnerships and how we can work together to develop some science manager partnerships around this. So that's what I've got. So any questions, I'm happy to take any questions, and I also would direct you to Lisa and Rachel if you have any other specific questions about this process that they'll be able to answer for you. And with that, I think I have a couple minutes for questions. Okay, that's it.
So at the beginning you showed this long list of potential areas that you're going to explore.
Yeah.
Are there any next steps beyond the workshop?
Absolutely. Yeah, I meant to say that. Thank you. So this was the first installment of ASAP. So we have the second installment already in the works, and that'll be on sea level rise and looking at the climate or the adaptation actions used in response to sea level rise. And again, Rachel and Lisa's teams will be working with us on that. And then, yes, we hope to have more and more installments of this. So we'll look at different climate change stressors, and hopefully in our future ASAP installations, we'll be able to look at more of a suite of climate adaptation actions. We didn't necessarily mean to just focus on one this time around, but through this process, that's kind of just how it happened. But yeah, we want to be able to evaluate a lot more adaptation actions at once. Anybody else? Yeah. That's a great question, and our team has talked about that a lot, you know, and so what we've done is we've been very strict about saying, yes, we understand that many of these actions were developed for other reasons, but now we want to know if you're intentionally using them to decrease vulnerability or increase resilience to climate change. And if so, are you modifying those actions in any way, or should you be modifying those actions in any way? So it is, we definitely know there's this, you know, a line there, but we still want to be able to evaluate the science behind that as much as possible. And if there's no science to support a particular adaptation action in the context of climate change, then okay, that becomes a research direction that maybe we can go in. Okay, I think I'm done. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.